All right, so you ready to dive into this whole unemployment thing? Why was it so different in the U.S. versus Europe between 2001 and 2007?
Yeah, that's a big question a lot of folks have been asking.
We're talking a pretty big gap, right?
Mhm.
Average unemployment in the U.S. was 5.2%, but in Europe specifically, Germany, France, and Italy, it was a whole 8.7%.
Makes you wonder what was going on.
Right. Well, we're going to try to get to the bottom of it. We're digging into this 2024 paper called Unemployment and Imperfections in Labor and Credit Markets. Hopefully that'll give us some answers.
It's a pretty deep dive looking at all sorts of things. Like, it's not just about one single factor. They built this whole model to simulate both economies,
Mhm.
looking at labor markets, goods, even how easy it is for businesses to get loans.
So it's a pretty comprehensive approach.
Yeah, they tried to factor in a whole bunch of stuff.
Okay, so where do we even begin with something like this? I mean, there are so many potential culprits, right?
Definitely. There are a lot of moving pieces.
Like taxes, for example. Everyone always talks about how taxes impact the economy.
For sure. And the paper highlights a pretty big difference between the US and Europe on that front.
In what way?
Well, the average income tax rate in Europe was 33.1% compared to just 24.6% in the US.
Wow, that's quite a difference.
It is. And it's not just about how much money people get to keep in their pockets. Higher taxes usually come with more generous social programs, right?
Yeah, things like unemployment benefits, welfare, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And those programs, while well-intentioned, can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Like what?
Well, think about it. If you're getting a decent chunk of your income replaced by benefits, it might make going back to work seem a bit less appealing.
Makes sense. There's less incentive to find a job.
Exactly. There's a 2005 study by Davis and Henriksen that found a tax rate difference, like the one we're talking about, could mean people work 122 fewer hours per year. That's almost 3 weeks less.
3 weeks, that's a lot of time.
Yeah, it adds up. So high taxes really could be putting a damper on the job market.
Okay, so we've got taxes as a potential factor. But what about those benefits themselves? The paper mentioned those, right?
It did. It cited previous research suggesting that overly generous unemployment benefits could actually make people less motivated to find new jobs.
So are we saying that helping people too much could actually hurt the economy?
Well, it's all about finding the right balance, isn't it?
That's a tough one.
Definitely a tough one. You want to provide a safety net for people, but
Yeah.
you don't want to create unintended consequences.
So what did Europe's benefits look like compared to the U.S.?
Well, remember that net replacement ratio we talked about earlier? How much of your old income gets replaced by benefits?
Yeah, I remember.
So in Europe, that actually went up during this period, from 59.7% to 62.3%.
So they were getting even more generous with their benefits.
Seems that way. While in the US, the net replacement ratio actually went down slightly.
Interesting. So we've got taxes and benefits potentially playing a role here.
Mm.
But what about the big one? Monetary policy. Surely, interest rates and inflation must have a big impact on unemployment.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah, high interest rates and inflation make it harder for businesses to hire.
That's the conventional wisdom, but this is where things get a little unexpected. The paper actually suggests that, at least during this specific period, monetary policy wasn't a huge factor.
Wait, really?
Yeah. They ran their model using US interest rates, and you know what? It actually predicted a slightly higher unemployment rate for Europe.
Wow. So the U.S. had lower unemployment, lower taxes, lower benefit replacement rates, and their interest rates didn't seem to hurt them either.
It's almost like they were defying the odds.
Right. It's like they were doing everything wrong according to what we normally think.
Maybe those central bankers knew what they were doing after all.
So if it wasn't monetary policy, what else could it be? What's left?
Well, there's one more piece of the puzzle. Credit market imperfections.
Credit market what now? That sounds complicated.
It's actually a pretty simple idea. Just imagine a company that has a great idea, an idea that could create tons of new jobs, but they can't get a loan from the bank to make it happen.
So that's what they mean by imperfections. It's about access to capital.
Exactly. Those imperfections are like roadblocks to job growth. The paper uses the ratio of domestic credit to non-financial corporations to measure how easy it is for businesses to get funding.
Makes sense. So how did Europe and the U.S. compare on that measure?
Well, the US had a much higher ratio than Europe.
Meaning it was easier for businesses to get loans in the U.S.
That's right. So it seems like more readily available credit could be a factor in lower unemployment.
Okay, so we've looked at taxes, benefits, monetary policy, and now credit markets. Did the researchers find that credit market imperfections were a big driver of the unemployment gap?
Well, their model did show that less developed credit markets contributed to higher unemployment,
This is always a but, right?
but it wasn't as much of a factor as those first two things we talked about, taxes and benefits.
Interesting. So are we saying that income taxes and those unemployment benefits were the main culprits in this whole unemployment difference?
It's starting to look that way. Yeah, their model actually suggests that those two factors could explain something like 70% of the difference in unemployment rates.
70%. Whoa. Okay. So if European countries wanted to try to lower their unemployment rates, it sounds like they need to take a hard look at their tax and benefit policies.
That's what the researchers are suggesting. Easing the tax burden on labor and reforming those unemployment benefit systems could have a bigger impact than just focusing on monetary policy or fixing credit markets.
So basically make it more attractive to work and maybe a little less comfortable to rely on benefits. But how would they actually do that? Did the paper get into specifics?
They don't lay out a step-by-step plan, but they offer some guiding principles. On the tax side, they suggest shifting the tax burden away from labor.
Okay, but wouldn't that just create problems somewhere else? I mean, governments need money to run, right?
Of course. It's about finding that sweet spot where policies can support a strong economy and social well-being. A tough balancing act, for sure.
What about those benefits? Are they suggesting just cutting them entirely?
Not necessarily. It's more about finding ways to make sure that the system encourages people to get back into the workforce, maybe setting time limits on benefits, offering job training, or making sure benefits don't make it more appealing to not work.
Yeah. So many things to consider. It's fascinating how different countries try to find that balance between supporting people and also encouraging them to work.
Absolutely. And that's what's so interesting about this research. It challenges us to think beyond simple solutions and really consider all the factors that contribute to a healthy economy.
Okay, so we've got the problem, we've got some potential solutions. But are there any real-world examples of this actually working? I mean, is this just theoretical, or has anyone actually tried to implement these ideas?
That's a great question. What good is research if it can't be applied in the real world right now? Luckily, there are some historical examples we can look at. In recent decades, several European countries have actually implemented labor market reforms, some focused on lowering taxes, others on changing their benefit systems. And it's a mixed bag in terms of results, but there are definitely cases where these reforms have led to increased employment.
So it's not just a pipe dream. These ideas have been put to the test. Did the researchers highlight any specific country examples?
They mention some of the challenges and successes in places like Germany and France, but they don't go into too much detail. They emphasize that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. What works in one country might not work in another.
Right. Every country has its own unique circumstances. It's like this whole unemployment thing is a giant puzzle with all these interconnected pieces.
That's a great way to put it. And the researchers seem to agree. They highlight the need for a holistic approach to unemployment, looking at taxes and benefits, but also things like education, job training, and even cultural attitudes towards work.
Okay, so we've got the problem, potential solutions, real-world examples. But there's one thing that's been bugging me. This whole study focused on the years between 2001 and 2007. But what about everything that happened after that? I mean, didn't the world basically go through a major economic upheaval?
You're talking about the 2008 financial crisis.
Exactly. Surely that must have had a huge impact on everything. Did the researchers even consider that?
That's a very important point, and it's actually something they acknowledge as a limitation of their study. They focus specifically on the pre-crisis period, so they don't really account for the effects of the 2008 crisis or the years that followed.
Well, that seems like a pretty big omission, don't you think? Those events must have significantly impacted unemployment rates globally.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that while this research offers valuable insights, it's only one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Okay, so maybe this paper isn't the definitive answer, but it's given us a lot to think about.
It really has. We've explored all sorts of factors that contribute to unemployment, uncovered some interesting policy ideas, and even looked at some real-world examples. And just like any good deep dive, we've probably uncovered more questions than answers.
And those are the questions we're going to tackle in the final part of this deep dive. We'll discuss some broader implications of this research and what it all means for policy decisions. Then, we'll leave you with some food for thought. Stay tuned. Okay, so we're back, ready to wrap up our deep dive into this whole unemployment mystery.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
We've talked about taxes, benefits, credit markets, and now I'm kind of thinking bigger picture. What does all this tell us about economic policy?
Well, I think one of the key takeaways here is that there's no magic bullet. No one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to unemployment.
Yeah, the paper really made that clear.
Each country's got to figure out what works best for them. What works great in one place could totally backfire in another.
And that makes me think back to that 2008 financial crisis we talked about. The researchers said their findings might not fully apply after that point, right?
Yeah, they acknowledge that as a limitation of their study.
So does that mean their work is basically useless?
Not at all. It's just, it highlights that economics research is always evolving.
Okay, so it's like one piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. Like a detective gathering clues. We're constantly learning more. And that 2008 crisis, well, it threw a whole bunch of new variables into the mix.
Definitely made things a lot more complicated.
For sure. So, yeah, their findings are still valuable, but they're not the whole story.
Right, it's an ongoing investigation.
Hmm.
Okay, well, before we wrap things up completely, I have one final question for everyone listening. Something to really think about.
Okay, I'm all ears.
The paper focused on the period from 2001 to 2007. And we talked about how things changed after 2008. But what about the changes that happened before 2001?
You're going way back.
Europe's economy has been changing for decades. They've been integrating, making their own changes to taxes and benefits.
You're right. That's a really important point.
The researchers didn't really dig into that history.
No, they didn't. It's like they started their investigation in the middle of the story.
And it makes me wonder, how did all those earlier policy changes, those earlier trends, set the stage for what they observed?
It's a fascinating question. How do those long-term trends in Europe compare with what was happening in the U.S. at the same time?
A whole other mystery to solve.
Exactly.
It just goes to show that context is everything.
Couldn't agree more. And for those of you who want to dive even deeper, we've got the full research paper linked in the show notes. Definitely worth checking out.
Absolutely. And hey, if anyone out there finds any research on those pre-2001 trends in Europe, let us know. We'd love to take a look.
Yeah, we're always up for another deep dive.
Always. So until next time, keep those brains working and those questions coming.